Purepeivi. Mun name le Troy Storfjell. Le an Sapmilash, Norgabiale Marco Sapmilash, Mutu Orun, ja Bargan, Pujalep, Stelekum, ja Nisquali Alpmukit Govlos. Gate mun mait Aikun Gatit. Hello, my name is Troy Storfjell. I am Sami. Mark Sami from the Norwegian side, but I live and work on the traditional lands of the Puyallup, the Steilacoom, and the Nisqually peoples, who I would like to thank and acknowledge today. I am also, through my mother, the descendant of white American settlers in the Pacific Northwest. My mother grew up in Portland, Oregon. My father grew up in Ballangen, or Ballat, on the Norwegian side of Sápmi. And I am a dual citizen who's lived in both countries, both as a child and as an adult. I am also a registered member of the Norwegian Sami electorate, and a professor of Nordic studies at Pacific Lutheran University in Tacoma. Today I'm going to be talking about Sami identity and genealogy. What does it mean to be Sami? So we'll start just by giving a little overview. Who are the Sami? We are indigenous people of Northern Europe, but we're not the only indigenous people of Northern Europe. You may have heard somebody say the Sami are the only indigenous people of Europe. Well, we are the only indigenous people of the European Union, but Norway's not in the European Union, so I'm not an indigenous person of the European Union. And Europe is bigger than the European Union. The Komi and the Nenets live in European Russia, and the Greenlanders live in Greenland, which is part of Denmark, and according to some classifications, therefore also part of Europe. There are approximately between 70,000 and 100,000 Sami living in 4 countries: Norway, Sweden, Finland, and Russia. Or at least 4 countries have claimed parts of our traditional homeland, Sápmi. Obviously, I'm living in the US. There are Sami living in more than 4 countries. We have 9 Sami languages, in addition to the 4 national languages. These Sami languages are not Indo-European. They're from the Finno-Ugric branch of the Altaic language family, distantly related to Finnish. Before I want to give a brief overview of Sami history from the beginning to now. But we want to move through this quickly. People have been living what is now Sápmi for about 14,000 years, since the glaciers began to recede during the end of the last ice age. There have been successive in-migrations of people over that time. That is, the people living today are not only the descendants of those who were there 14,000 years ago, but also of successive waves of immigrants. Sami identity itself emerged more than 3,000 years ago, and emerged through a process of differentiation, as most ethnic identities do. That is, ethnic identities emerge when groups of people find that they need to differentiate between themselves and others. And so they highlight certain things as the important boundary lines marking the difference between them and others. According to Professors Lars Ivar Hansen and Bjørnar Olsen in their 2004 book, Samenes historie fram til 1750, or the history of the Sami up until 1750, they make the case that it was contact with the metal-producing cultures, like the ancient Ananyano culture of central Russia, that led some of the inhabitants of the Nordic region to begin to develop a Sami identity as a way to mark their difference. Others, along the coasts and in the south of the Nordic region, developed other differentiated ethnic identities. And it's important to note that even after Sami identity emerged as a thing, even after people began to refer to themselves as Sami some 3,000 plus years ago, there was continued circumpolar contact between the Sami and other circumpolar peoples in Eurasia and beyond, even in North America. Now, prior to colonization, we Sami lived in a Sidat. A Sidat society was made up of a number of Sidat, in the singular Sida. The Sida was a community that was related to a specific area, a specific geographic region, the people who lived on that region. Usually several extended families, number of people ranging anywhere from 50 to 300 in number would be a Sida. And you have to remember, Sápmi is in the far north. We were hunter-gatherers, which means we needed a lot of area per person. So by many by the standards of many parts of the earth, Sápmi was thinly populated. People would tend to move out. The Sida council, made up of elders representing each family, and there was gender equity, that is, representatives for both men and women, would allot lands for summer usage to the different families. But everybody would come back together and live in the Sida village for the winter. We were hunter-gatherers, like I said, and lived off of a variety of different fish, game animals, and plants. For most Sami, the wild reindeer were one of the most important, if not the most important, game animal. The reindeer would migrate from the lowlands around the Gulf of Bothnia and inland from there, where they would spend the winter, across the mountains and out to the coast, where they would spend the summer. So you had a spring migration out to the coast and a fall migration back into the interior. And this way, the migrating reindeer would cross all the Sida boundaries and be hunted as they crossed each one. Now, during the Middle Ages, the Scandinavian and Russian societies to the south began to tax the Sami. There was a fur trade going back to before the Common Era, between the Arctic and the Mediterranean. That is, people from the Arctic traded with intermediaries, through intermediaries down to the Mediterranean. The furs, the hides, the feathers, and the amber from Sápmi were important goods valued in Southern Europe. And so access to them was important. And medieval Scandinavian societies found that they could tax the Sami. They could also trade with the Sami. And so the birkarlar system was set up by the Swedes, using Finnish merchants called birkarlar with a set of routes that they would travel each year, both to collect taxes, but then to conduct trade. In Norway, there was also the Finnskatt, the tax on the Finn or the Sami, and the Finnfad, the trading with the Sami. And these were regularized. But during this time, the Sami beyond the Lappmark border, according to the Swedes, or the Finnmark border, according to the Norwegians, were considered separate. About 500 years ago, large-scale reindeer herding supplanted hunter-gathering for most Sami Sidat. That is, as pressures mounted with this taxation, often a triple taxation. Most of Sápmi had to pay taxes to the kings of Denmark, of Sweden, and the rulers of Russia. Other parts only had two, and very few only had one. In the south, there were few that only had to pay taxes to one monarch. Because of the pressures of these taxes, the wild reindeer herds began to diminish, and so the Sami took over the management of the herds. And this was a remarkable transition in Sami culture. We went from being sedentary hunter-gatherers to semi-nomadic reindeer herders. Most of us, or most see that, not most people. It's always been a minority of Sami who have actually herded reindeer. But this brought profound transformations to Sami society, and the word Sida ceased to mean this physical area and began to mean the camp that moves with the reindeer herd. The Lappmark border and the Sami exclusive rights to it were certified by the kings of Sweden in 1320 and again in 1526. But in 1522, the monarchs of Sweden, Denmark, Norway, and Russia began competing against each other, and initially also against would-be Dutch and English colonizers to colonize Sápmi. It began because of mining, quickly led to slavery, and then moved on to settlement. Wars were fought between these powers over Sápmi, and the borders were extended between Sápmi, so that by the mid-1800s, by 1852, all of Sápmi was firmly incorporated within either Norway, Sweden, Finland, or Russia. Now, each of these countries had a different policy regarding the Sami. Norway in the 1850s began the policy of Norwegianization, that is, a forceful assimilation of the Sami into mainstream Norwegian society through such devices as boarding schools, as language laws, as land ownership laws that first said you could only own land if you had a Sami name, or rather a Norwegian name, And then later you could only own land if you could read and write Norwegian. All of these things were used to try to eradicate Sami language, Sami identity, Sami culture, Sami way of life on the Norwegian side. On the Swedish side, in the 1800s, the Swedish state adopted the policy of Lop ska vara Lop. The Lop, or the Lap, which is a derogatory term for the Sami, should remain Lap. That is, they wanted to protect the Sami from pollution by contact with more sophisticated settler cultures. Russian policies were a little bit different. They were for a long time managed by the Russian Orthodox Church, but early on, the Tsars granted special protections to the Sami from the church overstepping its bounds. So some interesting stories to tell there if we were going to go deeper into that history. Now, colonization continued. Things got worse and worse for the Sami, leading to political organization among the Sami. In 1917, we had the first Sami National Congress in Trondheim, or Trondheim on the Norwegian side. It was organized by Elsa Laula Renberg, a South Sami reindeer herder born on the Swedish side, and had Sami from multiple Sami areas in multiple states, multiple kingdoms. We moved from that early organization in the early 20th century to the CSV movement of the mid-20th century, beginning in the late 60s actually. CSV stood for Chayat Sami Voigna, or Show Sami Spiritual Identity, and was a cultural revival and ethnic pride movement. And then we had the Alta case in Norway in 1979 and 80, in which the democratic socialist Norwegian state planned to dam the Alta-Kautokeino River with the Alta Dam that would flood the Sami town of Matse, and that would put a number of reindeer migratory paths underwater. The Sami and environmentalists protested, blocked access to the site. They did a hunger strike on the steps of the Norwegian parliament. And in the end, through the largest police action in Norwegian history, the protesters were removed and the dam was constructed, but it was constructed on a smaller scale. The town of Matse was not destroyed, and many of the migratory paths were not blocked. And more importantly, though, public opinion in Norway had shifted to support the Sami, and so the government created a Sami Rights Commission. And it released its report in the later 1980s, saying that the Sami were indeed the indigenous people of Norway, and that their rights had been violated by the Norwegian state, and they recommended change to the Norwegian constitution. So we got the Sami paragraph of the Norwegian constitution that says that Norway was founded on the territories of two peoples, the Norwegians and the Sami, and that it is the duty of the Norwegian state to protect and advance Sami interests and culture. We got the Sami language laws, making the Sami languages found in Norway official languages. And we got the Norwegian Sami parliament. We also got Sami parliament in Sweden, on the Swedish side, in 92. And in 96, the earlier Sami parliament that had been established in the 70s in Finland was updated, reformed, and made more like given more of the same powers as the Norwegian and Swedish Sami parliaments. Then there was a backlash. Beginning in the late 1990s and extending through today in Norway, Sweden, and Finland, we've had public backlash against the Sami, against the rights that the Sami that we won for ourselves in the 20th century. So that's an overview of our history, but it doesn't say a lot about who we are. Now, if you know anything about the Sami, you've probably heard about the yoik, our traditional music form, in which we invoke the presence of a person or of an animal or of a place in the yoik itself. If you listen to yoik, if you study yoik, read about yoik, you'll discover that there are different styles or dialects of yoik in different communities. And yoik is one of our most important art forms. And of course, yoik was stigmatized from the 1600s until the late 20th century. In fact, many places today it is still stigmatized. Initially, it was seen as devilish, and the missionaries in the 1600s and 1700s forbade it. Then it was just seen as primitive, as something that only dirty, drunken, primitive people do. And so the revival of the yoik from the 1970s to today has been an important part of the Sami cultural revival and restoring pride in Sami identity, that movement. Many of you also know about the gakti, the traditional Sami clothing. Each Gakti shows where its wearer comes from, what area he or she is claimed by, belongs to, but also the way the Gakti is made and worn says something about the person. Now again, the Gakti was stigmatized for many years and generations, and the taking back our Gauti, the plural of Gakti, has been an important step also in the Sami revitalization movement. But those are the outward things that many outsiders know about the Sami. We have Sami culture. Of course, I don't want to generalize. When I say these things about Sami culture, these are things that are common in Sami culture. Every Sami person has a different relationship to these things. But there are some values that are passed on in Sami culture, like arbedehto, the inherited or indigenous knowledge that is gained not by reading about it in a book or listening to a lecture like this, but by apprenticing under a mentor, by working with somebody who knows and learning from her or from him, by watching the person who knows how to do things do the thing and imitating them and asking questions about it. This traditional knowledge derives from millennia of living in Sápmi and living off the land and with the land. Biriget is a value that we have. Biriget means making do, getting by, surviving no matter what. No matter how bad things get, we will make do, we will survive, we will manage. If we're missing money, we'll manage without it. If we're injured, we'll manage. We will make it through. We will persevere. We will find a way to use what we have to survive. And that is the value of biriget, not giving up. And that's an important value, I should say, because on the Norwegian side, they've been trying to get rid of us for 170 years. They haven't. We believe in biriget and we survive. In Russia, they've also tried to get rid of us, but in different ways. And we're still in Russia. There's the value of gullahallat. Gullahallat is dialogue, but the word doesn't emphasize speech. It's not talking to each other, it's listening to each other. We hear each other. So it emphasizes being open to the other person, to the other creature or being with which one is communicating. It's not all about what do I have to say to you, but what can I learn by listening from you. Gullahallat means that we approach each other in an attitude of mutual respect and mutual listening. And we have a value that's expressed in the South Sami term doimius vekke. Doimius vekke refers to that intersection of the aesthetic, the beautiful, the practical, the pragmatic, the useful, and the ethical. So doimius vekke refers to all of those things. A thing is beautiful if it is useful and if it is ethically made. It's ethically made if it's beautiful and useful, and it's useful if it's beautiful and ethically made. They're not separate things broken out into separate categories. They're one thing. Then doimius vette comes from that, and it is the most beautiful, the most ethical, the most useful. And it's the ideal towards which we Sami are supposed to strive. We're supposed to strive towards the ideal of doimius vette, of acting beautifully in useful and ethical ways. But to do so requires knowledge. We have to have a lot of knowledge. We can't just start making something. I can't just sit down and carve a guksi, a drinking cup, without having spent a long time learning how to carve that guksi. So it's not just something that you can just casually do and arrogantly do. It requires years of humility and learning to be able to practice doimius vekke. Now, we also have religions. A lot of people are interested in Sami religion. Well, what is Sami religion? Lutheranism. Lutheranism is the largest of the Sami religions. Within Lutheranism, Laestadianism, the Laestadian movement, is very prominent in a number of Western Sami communities. In the East, it's Eastern Orthodoxy. And so we have Lutheranism on the Norwegian and Swedish sides and much of the Finnish side, and Eastern Orthodoxy in the eastern parts of the Finnish side and the Russian side, and just the eastern sliver of the Norwegian side. And that's not what people want to hear when they want to hear about Sami religion. They want to hear about our pre-Christian beliefs, our traditional beliefs. But the thing is, although there are Sami who are atheists, Sami who are agnostics, and Sami who believe in other religions, who are members of other religions like Buddhism, Islam, other forms of Christianity, etc., the majority of Sami are Christians of one form or another. But our traditional beliefs have been incorporated into our forms of Christianity. so that the traditional beliefs live on today within a Christian cognitive framework, a Sami Christian cognitive framework. That is, we were forcibly Christianized, but we made Christianity our own. Traditionally, Sami have been rural, but we are increasingly becoming urban. There are more and more Sami living in cities and towns. Politically, many Sami are conservative, goes along with being rural, but there's been a strong tradition of radical Sami politics as well. The Norwegian Labour Party was a place where many of the early Sami activists on the Norwegian side, for example, organized. Those are just a few superficial things, a mad dash through Sami history and culture. You can't summarize a history, and you certainly can't summarize a culture briefly. But I want to point out some things. For those who are interested, there's plenty of reading one can do to learn more about the Sami. But of course, we're talking about Sami identity and genealogy. How does one come to be defined as Sami? Well, by being claimed by Sami communities. You are Sami if a Sami community claims you. That's important. Sami identity is based on kinship, on who we are related to. We have these 3 Sami parliaments in Norway, Sweden, and Finland, and they have criteria for who can vote, who can join the electorate. Like I said, I'm a registered member of the Norwegian Sami electorate. To be eligible to vote in the elections of the Sami parliaments, there are objective criteria and a subjective criterion. I'll start with the subjective one first, but that's not to say it's the most important. I just want to get it out of the way first. Subjectively, you have to identify yourself as Sami. I have to consider myself Sami in order to be able to vote in the Sami parliament. That's not the primary criterion. I have to meet the objective criteria also. But in addition to meeting those, if I meet all of them but don't consider myself Sami, then I can't vote. In addition to meeting the objective ones, I have to also consider myself Sami. The objective criteria say that anyone who is raised in a house where a Sami language is the language of the house is Sami. So if you grow up in a Sami-speaking household, you're Sami. If you grow up in a Sami-speaking household and consider yourself to be Sami. But colonization took away the language from many people. So if one of your parents grew up in a Sami-speaking house and you consider yourself Sami, you are also Sami. And because these efforts at taking the language away happened some time ago, if one of your grandparents grew up speaking Sami and you consider yourself to be Sami, you are Sami. Now, a little more than a decade ago on the Norwegian side, because Norwegianization along the coast really took off in the language began disappearing already in the 1930s, they extended that to a great-grandparent. So in Norway, if you have a great-grandparent who grew up in a Sami-speaking household and you consider yourself to be Sami, then you can vote for in the elections to the Sami parliament. Those are the criteria for voting, as some people argue that that's not about who is Sami or not, but about who can vote, and that there are Sami who can't vote, and they say non-Sami who can vote. But the only way there can be non-Sami voting is if people lie on the subjective one. If you meet all the objective ones and you don't consider yourself Sami, then you're not Sami. But if you register anyway, then you've basically fraudulently registered. Now, what about Sami in North America, and how did Sami get to North America? Well, as you know, Scandinavians have been involved in the colonization and settlement of North America, at least since the founding of New Sweden in 1638 on the mid-Atlantic coast of what's now the United States. We don't know if any Sami came over in that settlement, but we know that there were both Swedes and Finns who came over and settled, and that a lot of the Finns actually left the colony and went to live with the Native Americans. That colony only lasted till 1655, but when the English took it over, they didn't chase the Swedes and Finns away. They just incorporated them into the English colony. There was a larger general Nordic migration to the US and Canada beginning in the 1850s, and Sami came in this larger migration. A lot of the economic reasons that led poor Norwegians and poor Swedes in particular and poor Finns to migrate to the US led poor Sami to also do the same thing. And in many cases, when the Sami got here, they hid their Sami identity. They were moving away from their local community where there was so much racism and discrimination against the Sami that here they could settle alongside strangers who, yes, spoke Finnish like they did, or spoke Norwegian like they did, or spoke Swedish like they did, but didn't know that they were Sami. And so they could say, I'm Norwegian, I'm Swedish, I'm Finnish. And so for a lot of these immigrants, the Sami identity didn't survive more than 1 or 2 generations because people hid it. Certainly not all, but in many of these cases. There's that migration, those waves of migration continued, as I'm sure you know, from the mid-1800s to the early 1900s. But there was also a more special Sami migration to the U.S., Sami migration to Alaska. In 1894, the United States hired a number of Sami from the Norwegian side to teach reindeer herding to some Alaska natives. And so they brought these Sami over for the North Sami from Norway. And then they brought another group over in 1898. And the Sami established reindeer herding in Alaska, where it took off. But then during the Great Depression, it began to suffer because a lot of the herds had been bought up by corporations, and the corporations suffered in the financial crisis. So to save reindeer herding for Alaska natives, the United States made it illegal for non-Alaskan natives to herd reindeer in 1937. Some Sami had married into Native Alaskan families, and their descendants, some of them are still herding reindeer. So there are Sami herding reindeer in Alaska, but those Sami are also Alaskan natives. Those Sami who were not also Alaskan natives had to give up reindeer herding. And the president of Pacific Lutheran University, the university where I teach now, Johan Ulrich Xavier, he was the 4th president of PLU. His cousin, also named Johan, was among these reindeer herders in Alaska who had lost his reindeer. And so Xavier wrote to his cousin and got him to bring a number of Alaska reindeer herders down to Washington, where he secured land for them in Polspo and on elsewhere on the Kitsap Peninsula. And so we actually have locally, in our area, descendants of these Alaska Sami herders in and around Polspo. And then there are recent migrations. As in my own case, it has to do with education, traveling because of school, and students meeting each other and having kids, and professional reasons. So we still have trickles of Sami coming in to study, to work, and sometimes ending up in this country, or in these 2 countries, U.S. and Canada. Now, these are interesting bits of how Sami get here, but one thing that's missing from all this is colonization and racism. How race has grown as an idea or a tool for managing the Sami. And race is relatively new as an idea in human thought. Humans have acknowledged and recognized difference, cultural difference, linguistic difference, religious difference, and have not been blind to the fact that different populations sometimes look different from each other. Sometimes populations in one area are taller than populations in another, or have different types of facial features, have different skin colors. Of course, people have noticed this, but the idea of race only emerges about 500 years ago with the European discovery and colonization of the New World, particularly with slavery. As Europeans began to colonize the Caribbean, they began to establish sugar plantations. And sugar was a lucrative crop, but it required an intense amount of labor. And the only way they could make it work was if that labor was done by slaves. So as Christians, they could not enslave other Christians, but they could enslave Africans who were not Christians. Of course, the problem for these slave owners was that sometimes the African slaves converted to Christianity. And so the idea of race emerged to justify owning African slaves, even if those slaves became Christian. The idea of race posited that there was a fundamental difference in quality between different groups of humans, and that difference was biological, that simply because an African became Christian did not mean that she became equal to a Christian European. And that's where race emerges. And so it emerges at the beginning of capitalism and the beginning of modern colonization. In fact, colonization, capitalism, and racism are braided together. They're three strands of the same braid. They're each dependent upon the others. They, of course, grow out of earlier ideas of the wild. Medieval Christianity, medieval Europeans had inherited ideas of the wild from the ancient Hebrews, from the ancient and classical Greeks, and from the Romans. They all had ideas of the wild as being opposite to civilized. So there were these ideas of wild men and wild women in Europe. And Europeans knew about the Sami and wrote about the Sami, from Tacitus in Rome all the way through the Middle Ages. There were always people writing about the Sami. And the Sami came to represent magic, witchcraft, and the wild. Lapland witches were well known in Europe, as it was seen as where witchcraft came from. As Europeans continue to have contact in the New World, continue to expand their settlements in the New World, gradually this idea of the noble savage emerged. Already there was an idea of indigenous people as savage, that is at the opposite end of the spectrum from the civilized European, but that was seen negative. During the Enlightenment and Romantic periods, that came to also be seen, in addition to negative, as positive. There was this idea that we corrupt civilized people have fallen from our initial purity, and these savages maintain their purity, and so they're noble. And so this idea of the noble savage, it sounds, it must be better to be seen as a noble savage than an evil fallen savage or degenerate savage. But it still has this idea that we're savage, and it still, therefore, leads to discrimination and harm. Now, race didn't stop there, though. In the mid-1800s, race became scientific. Actually, that began in the 1700s with Carl Linné, who became Carl von Linné, but who Latinized his name as Carl Linnaeus. And it's as Linnaeus that he's known in English. He was a Swedish physician who became a botanist, physician by education, but became a botanist. And he's the one who created the binomial nomenclature system that we use for classifying life in science today, where we have the genus name and the species name, primarily in Latin, but also in Greek. And so, for example, we are Homo sapiens, belonging to the genus Homo of the species sapiens, related then to Homo neanderthalis, Homo erectus, etc., all in that same genus. Well, you're familiar with that naming system. Carl Linnaeus is the one who invented it. In 1732, as a student, he got a grant to study the flora and fauna of Lapland. And so he traveled throughout Lapland, Norwegian, Swedish, and Finnish Lapland, or Sápmi, cataloging everything that he found, including the people. And it's his writings about the Sami that are particularly interesting. And we could go into a lot more depth on that, but I'm keeping this brief. Suffice it to say that he came up with scientific explanations for the difference between the Sami and other people that had to do with differences in biology. And you can trace back to that moment in Linnaeus this idea of race as of scientific racism, of race, the science of race. Throughout the later 1800s, we had the lapologists, scholars who studied the Sami, studied Sami language, culture, but also physicality. They measured Sami skulls. And that led to the establishment of the Swedish Institute for Racial Biology, which was established in 1922 and focused on eugenics, genetics, and racial science. These people were particularly involved in skull measurement and quantifying, defining the different races of Sweden. There were three main races in Sweden: the Nordic race, the Finnish race, and the Sami race. And the Nordic race was noble and had these great ideas and were born leaders. The Finnish race was sturdy and hard workers, and the Sami were lazy and degenerate and simple-minded. This institute created a lot of the data that was used by Nazi scientists, and so played a profound influence on the development of Nazi racial thought. It kept going after the war until 1959, when it was not shut down, when it simply became the Institute for Human Genetics and is now part of Uppsala University. So that institute is still functioning, and it's functioning in genetic science. And so this brings us to DNA. to Sami DNA and the marketing of belonging. I'm going to start right just by saying DNA does not make you Sami. People have got to stop claiming that they are Sami because of DNA. Let's review. How can you qualify to be Sami? It's based on kinship, on being connected within a certain number of generations to a speaker of the language as family. Egil Ole, the fourth president of the Norwegian Sami parliament, said very clearly in 2012 that talking about Sami identity as a matter of genetics is racism. There is no Sami gene. There is not even an exclusive Sami look. There are a lot of people who talk about a stereotypical Sami look, high cheekbones, slanted eyes, short stature. And there are some Sami who may fit that stereotype. But actually what is much more than that, than actual look, is a desire to see us as if we fit that look. There's a history of targeting Sami because of our believed physical and racial shortcomings. We Sami come in all colors and all phenotypes. There are Sami of all races, except that we are classified as a race. Racial science, going back to Arthur de Gobineau in 1853, classified the Sami as the most primitive and most inferior race of Europe, and as non-European, as Asiatic. Now, I've said before, I've described race as a social construct that is invented by society. It's like language. Language is a social construct. Language isn't a physical thing out there in nature. It's something that we collectively as humans make. But like language, race is real. Think about, how do you understand the world aside from language? You don't. Language permeates and connects to all your understanding of the world. Yes, you also get other inputs, but they're always connected to and mediated by language. Race is real. It's felt on the body of those who are its victims. Frantz Fanon wrote about the fact of blackness. He said when he was called the N-word, it became real for him that he was black. He hadn't thought of himself as black living in the Caribbean, but when he moved to France to study, he realized that he was black, and blackness became real for him, became a fact. So race is real, but also a construct, in the same way that language is real, but a construct. Race is not biological, though. It just is, we believe it pretends to be biological, or it calls itself biological. Now, talking about DNA claims to identity, I am heavily influenced by a book by Kim Tallbear, a Lakota scholar. Her book, Native American DNA, Tribal Belonging and the False Promise of Genetic Science, which was published in 2013, makes a number of pointed critiques of the marketing of genetic ancestry testing and its relationship to claims of Native American identity. She starts by saying a gene is a molecule, not an identity. And she writes that Native American tribes each define membership in their own way, but that it is always about kinship and not about biology. She goes on to write that these tests are actually inaccurate. First, both scientists and consumers project their racialized understandings onto their understanding of genetics. This is the same way that we had this thing before called social Darwinism. It's people taking the ideas that Darwin posited in his book Origin of the Species in 1859 and began using them as metaphors for understanding society. They wrote about different races and different cultures as having evolved further, and so we could stratify humanity as more advanced, more primitive. And we had this idea of progress, that we progress up to the more advanced. That was them using science to make other scientific ideas. We may laugh at them now because science has decided that they're not valid, but they were scientifically valid. Racial biology was a valid science for a long time before we discredited it. But it's not just that they took science and misused it. Darwin's work lent itself to that because Darwin was heavily influenced by Thomas Malthus, who wrote on the Wealth of Nations and wrote about survival of the fittest. That's a Malthusian phrase, not a Darwinian phrase, but it came to infuse, he used actual phrases from Malthus and metaphors from Malthus in describing biological evolution, which meant that taking biological evolution as a metaphor for understanding human diversity was already there because of the language. He used language about human diversity to explain biological diversity. So the point of this is that scientists and consumers already have understandings of race and build those into the science. Also, however, these tests are inaccurate because typically they point to sequences that are common in what the test designers have designated as certain ethnic or racial groups. It's like you have a sequence that's common among the Sami. But these sequences can also appear outside the groups in which they're common. They just occur at a higher frequency in those groups. So having that sequence does not mean that you have an ancestor in that group, not necessarily. It could come from a biological ancestor in the group. It could come from a biological ancestor in another group that also, where those sequences are also present, just at a lower frequency. Even mitochondrial DNA tests are not always as accurate as people thought. For right up until recently, we believed that mitochondria were passed exclusively from mothers to their children. But recent tests or experiments have shown that they can also occasionally be passed from fathers to their children, which is something that is revolutionizing the way people understand genetic heredity. Another important point to consider is that the test makers, the test manufacturers, designate a group. They say, this is the Germans, this is the Dutch, this is the Sami. And those designations of whose genes are measured for frequency are arbitrary. They come from this imagined idea, this romantic idea of a past in which there was racial purity, and the idea that every racial group started off isolated from everyone else, only breeding with themselves, only having children with each other, and then modern times we've come together and mixed. But we were never isolated. We were always mixed. And so anybody who's got ancestors in Scandinavia, whose ancestors have been in Scandinavia for centuries, if all your ancestors from Scandinavia are recent immigrants, you may not share any of these biological ancestors. But anybody who has an ancestor who can trace ancestry in Scandinavia back several centuries is probably going to share certain genetic sequences. That's what happens when people live mixed in with each other. We have kids together. It's human nature. So we need to reject these ideas of racial purity and genetic purity and pure origins. They don't exist except in racialized fantasies. And then we have to think about indigeneity again. Indigeneity is about a relationship to land and to the state, not about biology. It's not a racial thing. Colonizers have wanted to see it as a racial thing so that they could control it, but being indigenous in general and being Sami in particular is not a physical thing. It's about belonging to a community. It's about kinship. It's important to note that you can be Sami if you're adopted by a Sami family. So with no biological Sami ancestry, you can be Sami. I know several Sami who are adopted into Sami families and are Sami, considered Sami by all Sami. One of our most beloved yoikers was born in Colombia and adopted by Sami parents on the Swedish side. He's as Sami as they come, a reindeer herder, a yoik performer, one of our best yoikers. And it's been that way for a long time. Now, these voting criteria don't allow people who marry Sami to vote as Sami. But traditionally in our societies, if you married a Sami person, you were considered Sami. So that's because you had a kinship relationship to a community. And so all of us who are Sami have ancestors who weren't Sami. And many, many people who are not Sami had ancestors who were Sami. So what about people who may be close enough in generations to count as Sami, but who were raised without a connection to Sami? I believe that one can become Sami if one has the necessary connections. But you can't just wake up one day and say, I'm Sami, and become an authority on being Sami. You have to develop a relationship to Sami communities, to Sami people, and be invited in. And it has to be, it's like this doimieswete, about learning with humility over a long time, building relationships, and then being accepted and being invited in. And what about people who are of Sami descent, but who are not close enough generationally to ever count officially as Sami? There's plenty of those people. I say those people can become allies who acknowledge their Sami descent, but also acknowledge their distance. And I say, be proud of your Sami ancestors if you're one of those people. Be proud of them. Learn more about us. Learn more about Sami. Become an ally. But please do not commodify our genes or steal our identities. That's my contribution. Olo getu. Many thanks for listening.